Hello and welcome to my second Dyson Sphere program belt tutorial, featuring sorters. So, as this is an advanced tutorial, I, very quickly, will not be going through the basic belt mechanics of how to create belts, change the height of belts, or even abuse half-height belts. This is all knowledge that you should have before watching this tutorial. Likewise, this will not go through the basics of how to connect sorters, how sorters connect to belts, or anything of that sort. These are also required prerequisite knowledge. Now, this tutorial also assumes that you have seen part 1. If you have not, please go watch that right away. You do not need to be experts of any of the tricks, but having a passing knowledge of how each of them works will help you greatly. Quick disclaimer, I do use mods. The only mod I will be using in this tutorial though is blueprint tweaks. And the only feature of this mod I will be using is the fact that the camera doesn't automatically go into overhead view when using the blueprint mode. After you press J, it gives you the regular Icarus camera, and this helps me greatly when I'm trying to pick out specific things from my pre-set up toolbox, or when I'm doing other things to do with specific height belts. Now, with that said, every single one of these tricks is 100% possible in vanilla. The only problem is it is slightly more tedious. I do recommend using these mods, but they are by no means necessary. Finally, let's get into the video. This first trick is simply how sorters interact with a blueprint system. For example, building a setup such as this near a fault line where the grid changes because of the curve of the sphere causes the sorter to get confused on where it wants to connect. Using blueprints, we can grab a single belt and sorter and then paste it while intersecting with the facility to easily control where the sorter connects. When copying sorters, it's important to remember the game will only let you copy if you have it connected to at least one thing, and will only let you paste when you're connected to two things. For example, when I copy this, it's connected to one belt, and it pastes when I connect it to a facility. But if I don't paste it connected to a facility, it only pastes to the belt, and the sorter is deleted. Trick 2 is how the sorter interacts with bendy belts. Say you were to attempt to use my 3x1 bent blueprint on a crafting setup. The sorters will notice the slope is too steep and slightly out of the way, and will refuse to connect. You could also attempt to make it work by placing the sorters down first, and then pasting the blueprint on top. Usually, if you were to put a belt underneath it, the lack of connection error will go away. But if you attempt to do that with a bent blueprint such as this, unfortunately this does not work either. It still shows a connection error. The best way I've found to consistently connect belts with abnormal slopes is to first place belt dots and then connect sorters to them. When you paste a blueprint on top of the belt dots, the game doesn't update the sorters, so they never notice the change and will stay connected. This, of course, persists between blueprints because the blueprint will always prioritize the sorter connection to prevent issues while copying larger setups. So you can easily take any of your janky setups and move it around wherever you need as many times as you want. Now, there are edge cases where this is complicated more. So say I have 3 input and 1 output. I have this 4x1 setup that should work just fine. But if I want to tile it, I need to tile the 4x1 first. Otherwise I get some weird interactions with the belts. So once you have it at the desired length, you'll notice that it still touches down at all the correct places. But this particular blueprint has a section where 2 belts are in a row on the ground. When this happens, sometimes the game isn't smart enough to notice that belts are connecting. So, when you have a setup like this with lots of single belts in a row, these 2 consecutive belts will bug out slightly. This is completely fine though. As you saw, it doesn't give any red connection errors and it places normally. Despite this, it still doesn't update all the belts correctly. All you need to do to fix this is to copy and paste the entire machine. When you do, the game notices its mistake and will fix it when it pastes. This can be kind of annoying when you're building a really dense or a very large machine, but if you just take whatever it is you're designing out of its context and then get it to function first and then place it where it needs to be afterwards, it's actually not too big of a hassle. So you guys may have noticed that I have really packed in these belts, especially this 4x1 insertion set that I've designed. As you can see, these belts get really close. There are 2 rules of thumb required to make consistent blueprints. The first one is to ensure the belt's actual location, as displayed by the circles in the blueprint mode, are no closer than 1/2 belt units close to each other, and that the distance between 2 connected belt locations are no further than 1 horizontal grid unit from each other. There are exceptions to these rules, but they are more than flexible enough for most cases. So long as you plan carefully, you should have no issues making setups like mine. Packing things together this way has sort of a side effect. As you can see, each individual piece of this setup isn't actually all that difficult to make if you use just regular belt bending. But if you attempt to paste all of these together, the game checks collision via the model instead of where the actual belt dot is. Unfortunately, that means we have to do a bit of a workaround to get things to connect correctly. Either you can very quickly paste something far enough away for your drones to not be able to immediately place it down twice. That's why I put them right next to each other and pasted. That way, I had enough time to just quickly move 1 unit and paste it again. And now I have recreated, pretty simply, my main setup. But if you prefer, you can also do it a much simpler way. If you just place down a container of some kind and put all your belts away, the game will give you the white belts, and they always use only the belt dot collisions, as you can see. Now once I've got those all put back together, I could grab them up again, and it works just fine. Let's talk about the ever-fun vertical belts. Unbeknownst to me, vertical belts are actually very easy to make. All you need to do is get to a polar region of a planet, then build a ramp, make sure to delete the flat ends so they can't interfere. Then, for some reason, the game just lets you paste the ramp directly onto the pole. After that, all you need to do is copy and paste it once more to get rid of this extra long blueprint, and now you have a beautiful vertical belt. Beautiful being a relative term. Thank you to AmishBug for showing me that much easier solution. Though, apparently, I like to find the hardest solutions to problems. This next trick isn't really the best for making vertical belts, it's still an important stepping stone for the next trick coming up, so I'm still showing you. I was browsing around the Dyson Sphere Community Blueprint website, and I found one of AIM34's weird belt collections. And while looking at it, you could see lots of weird 1/3 and 2/3 off-grid belts, and I just kept thinking, what in the world do these have to do with vertical belts he has here too? And AIM34, if you happen to be watching, let me know if I got this right. But while playing around, I remembered that when blueprints are close enough to a belt, the game will autocorrect it to make things more consistent. For example, if I was to make this diagonal belt and I wanted to blueprint something to connect to it like this belt is slightly off center. So as you can see, when I paste it, it still works fine. It just moves the ending of one of the belts. This addition was essential to making blueprints work consistently at different longitudes and latitudes, as well as making tiling consistent. A super great addition for the blueprints. But of course, I decided to take it to the extreme. So what I've done here is taken a bunch of belt dots at about 1/3 off grid and 2/3 off grid, and the last one is back on the grid. And you'll see, as I paste each belt, notice how the endpoints move slightly to compensate for the existing belt. This is how I figured out vertical belts on my own. Let me see. Yeah, there we go. I saved this just in case I needed to show it off. But yeah, that's what I did. I had a bunch of belts. I laid them all out. I made my my 0 to 1 height things on every single level, and I did it one at a time, and I made a pretty good chunk of vertical. What's special about these 0 to 1 height belts is that they can connect to sorters without colliding with them. Using the same belt dot trick, you can make any sort of input-output device you need vertically. This is what made my vertical belt insertion possible, and kicked off all those vertical belt setups you see now. Of course, because vertical belts were created by blueprints, they're super easy to blueprint too, just like all of my setups. As you can see, my toolbox has got a few of them. The next thing that Blueprint Autocorrects can do for you is make clipping through things much easier. So if you're ever in a pinch and you just really need to fit that power station in place, but you also really need one belt to go through that lane, you can. So if you were to use the Blueprint Autocorrect on these, it just very slightly moves the endpoints. That way, you now have a half-length belt and another half-length belt right next to each other, and they can connect. Now you have a full belt length right down the middle there that you can play with. That means you can make intersecting belts because, of course, it doesn't check collision except for where the belt dots are, and even have it intersect itself, or even a power tower. So, I'm sure all of you are wondering how in the world I built that belt elevator with teleporting items. Well, as you can see, I've also got these strange looking sorters and some floating belts above them. You'll remember from before, you can't copy and paste a sorter that doesn't have both connections connected. You can copy this sorter, but when you paste it, it'll only place the belt because the other end of the sorter doesn't have anywhere to go. If I were to connect it to either a facility or another belt, then it'll place the sorter down. But then how have I just copied and pasted these? These ones seem to only have a single connection. Well, the simplest way to put it is they are connected. If I were to place an item on this, you'll see the sorter still worked, and it placed it at the other end. So, I've got a bit of a theory on why exactly this works. Back when the game first added blueprints, there was a bit of a plague where blueprints weren't really working at different longitudes or latitudes depending on how the belt grid was warping, and that was because setups like these, or when moved to a different part of the grid, would slightly change where the belt was, and the sorter would realize this and be unable to pick up from it. And that broke lots of setups early on. It would disconnect and you'd have to go in and either extend it out a little bit or try and fix it another way, and it was just a big pain in the butt. But when they fixed it, it seems like they've just assigned one of the belts to the sorter, so that no matter where that belt is, it's still connected to the sorter via the blueprint. With that knowledge, and the blueprint autocorrect knowledge, you can easily make a set of blueprints to slowly pull away the belts. Now, you don't have to do them both at the same time like this. You could do one at a time if you want to leave one of the belts down, sort of like I did with these guys. I left one of them down here. But once they are out of the initial area, there's nothing to stop you from putting a half belt on top of it and doing regular belt bending to it. So that's what I did. All you have to do is use regular belt bending. It'll show a disconnection symbol for just an instant. That's normal. That's how sorters always work when you're messing with their belt. But yeah, it just works. Because the sorters don't have any collisions other than the collision right at the halfway point between the 0 and the 1 height, you can just sort of go out in whatever direction you want. As you can see, the game doesn't care about where the sorter visuals are. It only cares about the belts that were assigned to the sorter, and those are the ones that we auto-corrected out of the way. So, not only can you do crazy vertical setups like my elevator example, or simple horizontal setups like this, you can also use it to make a super simple insertion method. Like I said before, the input sorters only visually look like the pull from the bottom belt. But only when I place items in the top belt will it pick up any items. Using simple linear teleportation methods like this, it greatly simplifies the troubleshooting process of one-wide setups. With the previous belt bent methods, you need to keep track of what level the belts were on, and they switch constantly. With this method, you could design something like this, and easily be able to tell at a glance if you were low on, say, copper. And now, I just wanted to add a quick, well, as quick as I can get it, aside. As many of you know, I have a personal challenge to get as many belts as possible up a 2x2. But due to what I now understand, I have to sort of consider it finished. Like I said before, you can build basically anything, as long as you plan the belt locations at least one half of a belt unit away from each other. When I realized this, I began building elevators with that specific goal in mind, as well as stretching each belt at least one belt length vertically between the endpoints. As a consequence, excluding the very center, it's physically impossible to fit another belt into these elevators that I have now. As you can see, these blueprints are absolutely filled to the brim with belts. But if you take a quick look, you'll notice that this as dense as possible elevator is only half of this 32 belt elevator. That's because when you have belts that make 180-degree turns like that, they effectively fold in on themselves and only take up the space at the very center. This means you can also take another as dense as possible elevator and fit it around the folded elevator. That's what makes my 32 belt elevator possible. Not only that, but you can also fit another folded belt design on top of itself because it's checking the collision at the same place that the spiral one is. This means it would be best to split the question into two different categories. How many belts can you fit up a 2x2 area at all? And how many belts can you fit up a 2x2 area in a single blueprint? The first category would be answered, because the solution would be effectively unlimited, due to the fact that folded elevators can paste on top of themselves. All you would need to do is build a tall enough one. The second category is still useful for me, but as there's only room for 2 more belts that use the very center space that I've neglected to use, it's also pretty much complete, at about 18 belts. And with that said, it was a fun challenge. I hope you guys liked the ride along with me. At the very least, I hope you enjoyed the visuals I made along the way. And that's about it. Thanks for watching.